Good evening, all. In this second race report video, we're going to talk about the 1953 Mille, which had surprisingly little information available about it online, certainly not in any sort of cogent fashion, particularly for the number of entrants that it saw. So hopefully this helps collate all of that which I've been able to find into one vaguely helpful little video for anybody that's watching. Let's get started. 1953 was the first year for the new World Sports Car Championship, the first attempt to bring some international order to the chaos of post-war sports car racing. With a schedule featuring 7 races from the US to Germany to Mexico, the classic Italian road rally was also included as one of 2 such events in the championship, along with the Carrera Panamericana. Taking place on the 25th and 26th of April that year, this made it the second round of the championship, after the 12 Hours of Sebring. However, in those days, full championship participation was much less de rigueur, with locals comprising the majority of race entrants, particularly for those races with, shall we say, geographic diversity. As such, only a few of the participants in the 12 Hours of Sebring also entered the Mille a month later, most notably the factory Aston Martins, driven by Reg Parnell, second overall at Sebring, and Peter Collins, DNF, although with different co-drivers. Sebring victors Phil Walters and John Fitch, driving a Briggs Cunningham-developed C4R, were conspicuously absent, although they returned for the next round of the championship, Le Mans, in June. The Mille, so named for its nominal distance of 1,000 Roman miles, which equates to approximately 1,500 kilometers or 932 statute miles, was first conceived and organized in 1927 and ran until 1957, except for 1939, following a tragic loss of life in several accidents the previous year, and for those years subsequent when everyone was busy wasting fuel and manpower on aerial or naval combat or Belgium or something, resuming post-kerfuffle in 1947. The race generally followed a round-trip route from Brescia to Rome and back, originally as a form of symbolic protest by the organizers, all Brescia natives, against the Italian Grand Prix moving to Monza, but staying that way because it's really quite a lovely drive. Participation in the race, especially post-war, was consistently enormous. Every race since 1930, save the abrogated 1940 circuit event, which only half counts, had seen over 100 entrants, and 1949 saw over 300 entrants. 4 years later, where we sit today, saw a whopping 580 entrants, although only 491 of these actually took the start. Now, less than 10 years after the end of the war, and with the commensurate interceding need for all types of scrap metal that one could find, it's unlikely there were 580 purpose-built, purebred racing cars of the type we normally associate with this era in existence the world over. Anyway, the reason for the Mille's resounding popularity, in addition to the inherent Italian love for speed, was the remarkably relaxed entry requirements. The fee was nominal, originally a mere 1 lira. I haven't been able to determine if price increases were implemented at some point, but 1 lira was quite low no matter who you ask, and Ticketmaster fees certainly weren't a thing. And essentially any production-based vehicle was eligible to compete. I mean, can you imagine such a thing in the modern era? Everything from busted-up Altimas all the way up to Porsche 918s and Bugatti Chirons all showing up on a weekend to drive a 1,000-ish mile loop of closed-ish back roads and through towns and villages at top-ish speed. It provides some context around how the Mille ranked as one of the most dangerous racing events throughout its history, particularly for spectators. The factory Ferrari entries were heavy favorites in the lead-up to the 1953 race, having won the last 5 instances of the competition, and even more heavily favored given the absence of Mercedes. In the 1952 race, Mercedes W194s, better known, and slightly erroneously, as the 300 SL, came second and fourth, having fought a hard battle against hill climb expert Giovanni Bracco's Ferrari and Luigi Faioli's Aurelia. The third car entered was lost in an accident in practice. However, the result was sufficiently satisfying for the Teutonic team, and they did not again contest the race until 1955. Aston Martin, coming off their strong showing at Sebring, was also considered to be in with a shout of success, as were newly designed entries from Alfa Romeo and Lancia. Some of the world's great drivers were entered as well. John Fitch was driving a Nash Healey, Sterling Moss was in a Jag C-Type, Juan Manuel Fangio and Carl Kling were driving for Alfa Romeo. The aforementioned Reg Parnell, who overall was perhaps better known as a team manager than a racer, was driving his Sebring-winning Aston Martin. Mike Hawthorne was unusually driving a Ferrari rather than with the Jaguars, with which he was perhaps better associated, and the list goes on. There were also a fair number of famous non-professional drivers participating as well, most notably film director Roberto Rossellini, also driving a Ferrari. He was recently married to actress Ingrid Bergman, and she was adamantly opposed to his participation in the event. She reportedly laid across the hood of the car when it reached the turning point in Rome in an effort to encourage Rossellini's withdrawal. His Ferrari did end up failing to complete the race, out with differential failure sometime after the Rome checkpoint, but nevertheless. Scrutineering took place in the days leading up to the race. With so many cars involved, the process was understandably a long one, but the crowds turned out nonetheless to see all the new vehicles. Here's some technical insights on the new designs from our junior analyst on the ground.
The inboard front brakes will reduce the unsprung weight considerably.
Contrary to the starting order in modern rallying, and certainly contributing to making for more interesting racing spectacles, vehicles started with the smallest and least powerful cars first, as this reduced the time required for the event and conveniently saved the starting marshals time that could be better spent drinking coffee, looking stylish, and saying ciao a lot. Each vehicle, starting in 1949, was assigned their start time as their race number, with the first vehicle departing at 9 p.m. or 2100 hours on the night of the 25th in the case of the 1953 race. The exception to this, at least in 1953, were the first 90 cars, which were numbered 1 to 90, kind of figures, and all departed in the first hour, with approximately 30 seconds between each start. First off were, blanket apology for here and hereafter about any Italian mispronunciations, Bruno Cavallo and Giuseppe Baboccia, driving a Fiat 1100 Topolino. Then followed another Fiat 1100 Topolino, and another, and another, and another. And it wasn't until one made it to number 16 that a non-Fiat made an appearance with the Panhard Dyna of Valdemar Merloni and F. Marsili bringing some diversity to the party. Although, after the first 90 vehicles, most of which were still Fiat 1100 Topolinos, had departed, numbering was done within the assigned schema, and the car bearing lucky number 2200 that year, and departing at 2200 hours, was a Sciata 300 BC, driven by Monsignori Gianfranco Ghi and G. Zanforlin, followed precisely 1 minute later by Messieurs Darquier et Bergeret, driving a comically small and arguably out-of-place Renault 4CV. I say out of place, but 23 of the things were entered in total, with 19 taking the start and 13 finishing. A respectable result overall, although the best placed among them was a somewhat less respectable 121st. The starts took place every minute, on the minute, until the next morning at 6:38 a.m. For those of you keeping score at home, that's almost over 9.5 hours of starting racing cars, when the Jag C-Type of Tony Ralt and Len Hayden roared off into the Italian countryside. I have to say, if I put on my non-race fan hat for a moment, I think that I would have just gone on holiday to avoid having that noise running all through the night for the weekend of the race. I mean, me personally, I'd have been sitting front center watching everyone take the start, but that's beside the point. Here we see a terrifying inflatable bibendum atop a Michelin advertising vehicle. No real reason to include it, but I had to see it, and now you do too, dear viewer. As with modern road rallies, there were established checkpoints for the cars along the route to ensure nobody tried any shortcuts or subterfuge to gain an upper hand. That year, the route went from Brescia down through Ravenna and along the coast to Pescara, before turning inland to L'Aquila and running through Rome, after which it headed north again to return to Brescia along an inland route that passed through Siena, Florence, and a final checkpoint in Bologna. At the turn, it was one of those Fiats, number 6, and incorrectly identified in the original newsreel footage by the narrator as a Panhard, that was running third in class and managed to overtake its competitors to be the first vehicle of the race over the Radicofani Pass as it wound its way through Tuscany. It was the first time in several years that the rains held off, allowing speeds to trend higher and see records broken again. The high-tuned Ferraris and Alfas were in particularly fine form, with the Ferrari setting a record of over 100 miles per hour for the first leg of the race and sounding spectacular while doing so, only to subsequently have its best time to Ravenna beaten by an Alfa a little later on. Let's have a quick listen to the Fezza as it passes through the Ravenna checkpoint. Unfortunately, as was usual for the time, there were several fatalities in the race. Pierre Gilbert Uno, navigator of one of the Jag C-types, lost his life when the C-type crashed after covering around 140 miles, while driver Luc de Collanche was in a coma for 3 days, but eventually made a full recovery. A spectator was killed when a Porsche 356, driven by Juan Iturralde and future FIA President Paul Metternich, crashed near San Marino, and a young child was similarly unfortunate after an accident involving one of the many Fiat 1100s in the race. Further accidents and mechanical failures throughout had already ruined the victory aspirations of a number of notables, including Sterling Moss in his Jag, brake failure, Donald Healey himself in one of his eponymous 100s, go watch that video if you haven't already, broken axle, Luigi Parenti's Ferrari, out because of an accident, Taruffi's Lancia with a bad engine. In all, by the turn at Rome, 12 of the 26 Ferraris were out of the race, as was one of the Alfas that had taken an early lead. But there were still an equal number of well-knowns in the race, including Fangio in his Alfa and Bonetto in his Lancia, surging along the Italian highways and byways. The Carl Kling-driven Alfa was fastest to Rome, followed by Fangio's, but the wisdom of Biondetti held true, that he who leads at Rome does not win the Miglia. And indeed, Kling's Alfa failed to finish the race, although Fangio, in the other car, managed second overall, despite fading brakes and steering difficulties. He surrendered the lead to Giannino Marzotto, the 1950 winner, driving a Ferrari 340mm, and Marzotto brought the Ferrari the rest of the way home to take the overall victory. Marzotto's car was, in many ways, an unlikely winner. He had originally committed to drive for Alfa, but the ride was given away to another driver, usually reported as Senesi, while Marzotto was out of the country. He was unsuccessful in finding a drive from Lancia, and it was only reluctantly that he asked Ferrari for something to drive, having developed a somewhat fractious relationship with the Il Commendatore. Not that we've ever heard that before. The only vehicle available was a 340mm left over from a recent victory in the Giro de Sicilia, but its brakes were shot after the last race, and it had not been repaired or really even looked at since then. Quick work by the Ferrari mechanics and engineers fixed the known issues on the car, but this meant that some smaller details were missed. The hood was stuck, unexpectedly, and this wasn't realized until Marzotto arrived in Siena and went to refill the oil. Unable to do so normally, he departed and then realized that he actually needed oil, so turned back, and they eventually had to cut a hole in the car's hood above the filler cap and pour it in that way. This came just before he went on to break the 15-year standing record for driving the Fiat Pass, and still managed to have a few small crashes on his way to overall victory in Brescia. The average speed for the Ferrari was 88.96 miles per hour, which, quick mental math makes that about 145 kph, for a finishing time of 10 hours, 37 minutes, and 19 seconds. The Maserati A6 of Emilio Giletti and Guerrino Bertocchi won the Sports 2-liter class, while the Oscar MT4 of Bruno Venezian and Achille Albarelli took home top honors in Sports 1.1. An Alfa Romeo 1900 was victorious in the Touring 2-liter class, driven by Luciano Pagliacci and Vasco Parducci. Touring Unlimited went to a Chrysler Saratoga, of all things. That was helmed, and I use that word with full intent, by Paul Frere and André Mille. Touring 1.3 by Guido and Carlo Mancini in a Fiat 1100. Sport 750 by the Panhard of Tuzo and Persillon. And Touring 750, finally, by a Renault 4CV, driven by Adriano Angelali and Mario Recchi. More than 5 hours separated Marzotto's victory time from that of Signori Angelelli and Recchi. The Ferrari finished in the aforementioned 10 hours 37 minutes, while the Renault was a comparatively leisurely 15 hours 46 minutes and 12 seconds. G. Franzi and M. Vino were the last to finish, classified 283rd and driving a Seata Amica in the Sport 750 class. They spent over 200 hours on the course, completing the race in 22 hours, 25 minutes, and 42 seconds, 25 minutes slower than the next fastest finishers. One can only assume that, true to their the driver or navigator's name, they stopped for a few glasses of vino on the way to their eventual finish. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. As always, hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what race you'd like to see next in this video format. We won't have James doing his traditional call to action today. Those are, I think, going to be reserved for Friday videos from here on out. Anyway, have a good evening all.